And welcome to another edition of the Michigan Conservative Roundtable. We're like the five, but there's only three of us, and without Dana Perino. Today you're going to get a Marty monologue where we have just the right amount of alliteration, and we're going to talk about the income tax. You might remember on my last monologue, I started to go on about it a couple times, and I caught myself. Why? Because I wanted to talk about it in more detail right now. The first thing I want to say is that pay your income tax. It is the law, no matter how much we may dislike it, no matter how much the government's spending money on that we don't think they should spend money on. Pay your income tax. It's just the way things are right now. And you can fight injustice better outside of prison than in prison. And if you don't get thrown in prison for not paying it, you're going to pay some pretty hefty fines. So pay it. Having said that, I'd like to remind people of something that Chief Justice John Marshall said almost 200 years ago now. The power to tax implies the power to destroy. And that's something we've got to keep in mind anytime we talk about taxation of any kind, particularly with the income tax, okay? Because that brings the government's power right down to each individual, which means the government could theoretically destroy each individual. It's why the framers didn't like, they called it a head tax at the time because of a little your head, because you are who you are and you've got the money you've got, give us some of it. So in the original Constitution, it was specifically prohibited, and the Supreme Court throughout the 1800s routinely threw out federal income taxes. That's why they needed the 16th Amendment back in, I think, 1913 in order to justify it, because it was not allowed up until then. Now we have an income tax, and I think it should be banned. I think it should be obliterated on the federal level. I really think it should be obliterated across the board on state and local levels too. But within the states or the localities, you've at least got the option of moving if you don't like the tax system. With a federal income tax, you're not going anywhere except maybe to another country, which is probably going to have an income tax anyway. So I'm for abolishing it at all levels, but especially the federal level. I think it is important. I'm not wholly libertarian. The government does need to exist and it needs some money. So how's it going to get that money? I think the obvious thing are sales taxes. You know, just tax goods and services or whatever. Make some reasonable exceptions. Here in Michigan, there's no tax on unprepared foodstuffs or medicines. So I would think things that important should be exempt from it. But go for sales taxes. Go for user fees. If you own a car, then let's have tax on the gas or tax on the vehicles to pay for the roads or whatnot. Things like parks. There are national parks, there are state parks, there are local parks. I think that only people using the parks should have to pay for using the parks. So that's a form of a user fee. But when you get into specific things like that, if you want to have a park, then you got to have fees to enter the park, and those fees must cover the expense involved in running the park. People using things like that should be paying for them, not someone, quite honestly, like me who never goes to a park. Why are part of my taxes going for that? And we could come up with other examples as we went along, but that's just a couple right there. Another is a VAT tax, a value-added tax. Not real fond of that because it can really drive up the cost of goods. And I'm also not fond of it because the Europeans like it, and I'm kind of skeptical of anything that the Europeans like. But a value-added tax, if you don't know, is that during a process, particularly a production process, every time something is changed or altered, therefore a value is added to it, there's a tax on that added value. Okay? And that would be another way that governments could get their money. There may be other ways, but I like those three because they've got two big things in common. First and foremost, they're automatically graduated. People with more money are going to pay more in taxes because they're going to spend more money. Yeah, I know your rich Uncle Cloyce out there may have $1 million hidden in a jar in his backyard, but most people with $1 million aren't going to do that. They're going to spend it in some way, shape, or form, which means they're going to be more subject to these taxes, which means they're going to pay their fair share, if that's a term you want to use. But also, it takes the power of taxation back to the individual instead of being on the government. You can regulate how much you pay in taxes by how much you buy. Okay? So it gives, and I think where the control lies is very, very important. And we really want as much control lying with the individual in our country, in any country really, but our country in particular, since we're talking about the U.S., We want the individual to control as much as possible, and that includes the amount of taxes that he pays. Now, this sort of thing would require certain deep cuts in government spending, and I won't get away from it. But there's areas where the government could easily cut their spending. Education comes to mind. Now, bear in mind right this second, I'm talking in particular about the federal government, and there simply shouldn't be a federal Department of Education, okay? The left, our progressive friends, want diversity, 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 but then we're going to centralize the whole education establishment in Washington, which means everybody gets taught the exact same things, the exact same way. I'm going to use the word control again. That's a way of controlling people, and we see it in academia, and we see it in K-12 education. And a lot of it is because these mandates come from on high. But to back up to my immediate point, the government needs to cut spending, and Washington has no business being in education. Department of Energy is another good whipping boy of us conservatives. Milton Friedman famously said, the wheel, the internal combustion engine, other things, other advancements in energy, all came about without a federal Department of Energy. Advancement and innovation can come from the individual if he's left free to advance and innovate. So we can get rid of the Department of Education and Energy. Thought you had me there, didn't you? Get rid of overregulation. There's too many regulations. It's not only that the regulations are onerous themselves, but they require people to enforce them, which means they have to get more money to pay these people, blah, blah, blah. We have to stop with the overregulation because that requires a certain amount of people overseeing the enforcement of the regulations. So getting rid of overregulation saves us a lot of money too. The IRS, we don't have the income tax. The IRS is certainly going to be reduced in scope and size, isn't it? That would save us some money. And I really believe we've reached a point myself that we should at least consider scaling back on our military obligations. I mean, Germany, Japan, they're both more than able to take care of their own military needs at this point in time, and they should be expected to. One of the reasons Europe in particular has been able to have such great social spending is essentially because the U.S. has foot the bill for their military defense. And I think we can get away from that, and that would save us some money too. So what's my ultimate point here? My ultimate point is that income taxes are generally immoral, and I do mean immoral. Okay? Off the top of my head, we need a crisis along the lines and scope of World War II before you would see me supporting a federal income tax of some sort. Why? Well, let me ask you something. Does your neighbor have the right to know how much money you make? Then why does the government? And the government really is just another one of your neighbors, effectively, isn't it? So if your neighbor doesn't have the right to know, why does Uncle Sam? Now, I know the justifications they give is because you cheat on your taxes. Well, that's presuming guilt. And if I understand the Constitution and the basic laws of the United States, we're supposed to presume innocence. You know, but the income tax, since you've got to tell them what you make, they're presuming that you're going to cheat. And that's wrong. And it also allows a certain system of spying on each other. You know, businesses have to report to the government what they've bought from other businesses and this and that. You know, and I don't really think you encourage a trustworthy sort of system when you're really encouraging neighbor to spy upon neighbors. So, again, to repeat, pay your taxes. It's the law. There's no point losing your freedom over it, but income taxes are immoral. We should abolish them outside of extreme circumstances. And that is my Marty monologue for today. Thank you for listening. Remember, as always, be safe. Watch your six. Don't tread on me.
That's pretty good.